Hello and welcome to I've Never Read Discworld. It is your old reader, PJ Hart, the Cohen the Barbarian of this particular episode. Joining me is
Andy Luke. I will be the true flower tourist. And if I'm cosplaying the Light Fantastic, I'm going to go with Lockjaw, the dwarf jeweler.
I think we're gonna have a good time together as Cohen and Lockjaw do in the Light Fantastic. A few favors for one another. So hopefully that's the kind of dynamic we're developing. So I'm sure you're not just joining us for the first time. This is our second foray into the Discworld series. We're dealing with the second novel released in chronological order. Andy has read it for the first time this past month. I read it for the first time about 25 years ago. It is actually, believe it or not, and you probably won't believe it, the first Discworld story I ever read. And we'll talk about why that makes no sense and why that's a terrible, terrible introduction to the series a little bit later on. First of all, before we do that, I want to go straight to Andy for some first impressions. So, as I kind of hinted at there, Andy, this is pretty much a direct continuation of The Color of Magic, right? So, from my point of view, it probably wasn't a great place to start, but for you,
Loved
going
it.
straight from one end to the other,
Hit the ground running. Just
fantastic.
page turn, page turn, page turn, page turn. I must have been at least three-quarters of the way through the book before I looked at page numbers.
Wow,
Some books you just am I there? Am I there yet? Am I there yet? This didn't have that. It was just total pleasure.
amazing! That's great, and that differs slightly from your experience with The Color of Magic,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that was much more of a bit of a turn, stops and starts here and there, and
Yeah.
um,
And one thing we touched upon last month, I guess, something that surprised me when I first read The Color of Magic quite recently, was how episodic it was. Whereas The Light Fantastic is much more how I picture a Discworld novel in my head. It's like it's a coherent story from start to finish, even though it's set up. The beginning of the story is set up in The Color of Magic, like you said. Once we hit the ground running, literally, because that's what happens at the very start of the story, right? Rincewind and Twoflower hit the ground again. They come back to Earth, literally, from their journey in space. So I suppose actually something we should say is that we were pretty vague on spoilers and stuff last month, right? I think now that everybody knows what we're doing, I
put it
think
all
it's
out.
all fair game now, right? If you're in for a penny with us, you're in for a pound. We're going to talk about these books. We're going to talk about what happens in these books, right?
Talking book two, we're talking
So
book one. We're not
exactly,
talking book three.
exactly, yeah. So I mean that's it. Not that that's much of a spoiler anyway. I mean, it happens right at the start of the book. We left our heroes; they were floating in space. At the very start of this one, they come crashing back down to Earth. Uh, and then, as you said, the adventure just kind of continues at a much, much higher pace in this book, perhaps than it did in the last one.
Yeah, what's really interesting about this book, I might just sort of pin down like sort of where the Light Fantastic has got similarities with the Color of Magic is a sort of 5, 6 adventure chunks, but the flow is much greater. And then you've got these big meta plots happening parallel to one another. The Rincewind versus a spell, the Red Star that looks set to destroy this universe Pratchett has just created. Um, so those are two pretty big things.
Yeah,
Um,
it gets apocalyptic pretty quickly,
yeah,
considering it's book two. But I mean, I guess if you were reading it in the 80s, you wouldn't know that it's book two. Although it's a fantasy book, so you're guessing you're going to get at least three. You're going to get at least a trilogy, right? But I mean, in saying that, this story actually does wraps up pretty well as like a duology. Is that what we're calling it? But it isn't part two of a trilogy, is it? I mean, it really is. it's the second part of this particular story, and The Color of Magic and The Light Fantastic are quite often discussed as a singular unit, I guess, when we're talking about Discworld. So do you feel satisfied by that kind of two book story arc?
Yeah,
Or
what I was thinking? It's more like a so you five parts of the Color of Magic, and I
Mm,
like Fantastic just feels like part six. It's much more epic blockbuster stuff.
yeah,
Final act.
absolutely. And what are your highlights then of that epic blockbuster
Well, I
journey?
think we're maybe about you're gonna like this, PJ.
Ooh.
And I should probably sort of get this embarrassment for our video viewers. I made far too many notes. I have like 20,000 post-it notes.
For those of
Um,
you who aren't watching on video, I should let you know that they're color coded. I can
yeah,
see pink, green, yellow, blue.
perhaps affected by the chaos. I just whatever color took my fancy. Um, but about 20 pages in, we get a really full appearance of Death, who shows up summoned by the unseen university, fresh from a cocktail party or in the middle of a cocktail party.
Yeah.
It's about a sort of 4-page, 3-page sequence, and it just had me in stitches the whole way through. I chuckled some quite loudly.
Yeah. I mean, you could probably tell in our last episode, even though like The Color of Magic was a lot fresher in my head, I only read it last year. I hadn't until this month, I hadn't read The Light Fantastic since 1997. But a lot of the stuff I was asking you was preempting stuff in The Light Fantastic, and that penny's probably dropped for you now. Where I was asking you stuff about death, I was asking you stuff about the wizards, because in my head it is all kind of the one story, and like a lot of the most memorable stuff is in The Light Fantastic, isn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So that
Similarities as well. We talked about that going on with Strata. Um, but you've got Cohen and Bethan, who are pretty much the third and fourth characters, or fourth and fifth, and
that's right.
they're
I remember I was asking you about Cohen as well, and he
yeah,
hadn't really
yeah.
made an appearance. And how do you feel as the replacement for Hrun, who I knew you were a fan of in The Color of Magic? Do you don't miss him because Cohen's on the scene, or?
No, I mean Cohen and Bethan both have fantastic entrances. Cohen with his dentures is and his real bad boy attitude is wonderfully magnetic. I thought it was interesting that Terry went with. I mean, he could have just reused Ron and Liesa,
Yeah.
but chose not to, and it's a deliberate attempt to expand the world rather than just rest on what's
Yeah,
already there.
I had a similar feeling in reverse, because I read them in reverse, I guess, but I didn't want to touch on it last month because I didn't want to preempt too much stuff from this. But yeah, I found that quite interesting how there is obviously something in that like Burroughsy, barbarian-y kind of aesthetic that he finds inherently comedic, and he's right. Like barbarians are kind of dumb. Like it's a silly concept for sure, especially this kind of heightened 1980s Conan the Barbarian, Arnold Schwarzenegger Conan the Barbarian version of it. So like you can see he's kind of noodling with that in The Color of Magic, and then he hits on his like best version of that idea, which is like, what if this guy was like 100 years old? And that is funnier. And like he's already give Ron and Liesa their kind of little package deal, and they're off presumably living happily ever after. So it does feel like a little bit of a retread for me, but like it's different enough, and he's taken it like far enough to the next level where, like as you say, you love their introductions, you love spending time with them, and they get a lot more page time than Prun and Liesa do
Yeah.
as well, don't they?
So taking it back to the beginning, we've got death, and then we've got the siege at the gingerbread house. Were those elements that stuck out to you when you read this way back when?
Yeah. So I suppose now is a good time as any to tell that story of when I first read The Light Fantastic. So it was the first Discworld story I ever read, which was a mistake for sure, because it's halfway through a story. It literally begins on a cliffhanger. But the reason for that is, so when I first came to secondary school in 1997 in the middle of Belfast, which was a different time to say the least, and I was kind of coming in from the outskirts, and it was like a bit intimidating, a bit of an intimidating experience moving from like a little school in suburbia to this really big secondary school in the middle of the city that had a jail on one side and a British Army base, an active British Army base, just 1997 on the other side. And like a lot of kids coming from like a lot of rough areas nearby. And it was just like a lot. So like I found myself in the library quite a bit, just kind of hiding, I guess. And this is the first time I'd ever seen trade paperback comic books, so graphic novels, I guess, right? And it's amazing. I'm still amazed to this day that our school had this really great collection of trades and graphic novels, including like Neil Gaiman stuff, like DC Vertigo stuff, and amongst that was the Light Fantastic graphic novel, not the Color of Magic graphic novel, annoyingly. But for whatever reason, I picked it up. I was drawn to it. I took it home. Like yourself, couldn't put it down. First time I ever read it, a story of that length in one sitting. Even though, I mean, obviously now you sit down, you can read a trade in one sitting. Any adult can. But like I was 11 years old. This is like, you know, you open the first page of the Light Fantastic. It's the middle of the story, but I was drawn to it anyway. Like the artwork, all the caption bubbles, not bubbles. You know what I mean? You're a comics guy.
Panels, speech balloons.
Yeah. Well, the narration captions were just blew me away because it's all lifted pretty much word for word
Okay.
from the novel. So Sir Terry is talking at you through the captions. The art is like really typical, like 1980s, like Warrior magazine British comic book art style, I guess. You know, for me at the time, my reference would have been like Games Workshop, like Warhammer 40,000 kind of style art, where like everything's just a little bit larger than life, a little bit cartoony, but also like a little bit dangerous. Like when somebody gets cut in half, you can still see their spine, and that happens when Cohen cuts somebody in half in the like Fantastic, right? So this was just like absolute sensory overload for me. 11 years old, sitting in the library in St Malachy's College in Belfast in 1997. So as I said, I read it in one sitting, and I was like, okay, that was awesome. What's next? So I went back to the library, dutifully returned my copy of the Light Fantastic graphic novel, went to see what else was available in the Discworld series. Nothing. Went to see what else was available by Terry Pratchett, and they had Carpet People, I think. So then I went on a journey similar to your initial journey, which would have been Carpet People, Truckers, Diggers, Wings. And then after I'd read all those, my sister reintroduced me to Discworld via another book, which we'll talk about later in the series when we get to it. So that was my introduction to the Light Fantastic. And obviously it left an impression on me. I got really into Terry Pratchett after that. But I didn't initially miss Rincewind. I didn't miss Two Flower. You know, I mentioned last month, like he was never my favorite Discworld character. But you never forget your first. So I do always have a bit of a kind of warm feeling about the Light Fantastic specifically, even though like of all the various intertwining stories in Discworld, like Rincewind's series is not my favorite, but like I'll always remember the Light Fantastic fondly, especially for Cohen, you know.
Want to get into the graphic novel stuff later. I'll
Yes, definitely.
talk
Yeah.
about why that is later. But one of the things that really draws me to Rincewind, seeing you've brought him up, is this conflict with the spell. And there's this spell at the back of his mind that has messed up his life choices, that has there's just sort of it's like so I people who know my best work which is Absence, a comic about epilepsy. You know that I suffer from this sort of minor but persistently annoying condition,
Mm.
and I was very much able to relate to Rincewind and in sort of having this sort of neurodivergency that has ruined his life, in his words.
Oh yeah, that's interesting.
Um, and that kept me coming back, and it's kind of one of the major themes in both these books.
Mm.
Um, so yeah,
So
maybe
I
that's
never, as a kid, like I never would have picked up on that. There's so much in this book. Now looking back at it, as I have obviously been over the last few weeks, I think what is really sticking out to me now is that stuff like that like yeah, having the spell stuck in his head that could be a metaphor for neurodivergency or for any number of other things, I suppose. Like big really big metaphors like that just went like straight over my head when I was 11 years old. Like obviously I could tell that Cohen was like an old version of Conan the Barbarian, but like all those big themes were just lost on me, and I think that's a little bit why I maybe wasn't able to kind of engage with and relate to Rincewind quite as much then as maybe I can now. You know.
so we move into the sort of second act. We've got Tryman navigating Galder into being consumed by the luggage. Um, the Tryman Galder thing was really interesting to me. I We're going to talk a bit about the film later, where Galder's a more typical looking wizard.
Yeah.
But I very much had this picture of this sort of 1980s Thatcherite yuppie in my head, where
Oh,
he's
that's
coming in and
interesting.
he's renovating the old ways, and he's trying to increase efficiency, and um, certainly
And
a Tory.
yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, I
who
think
gets screwed in the process.
with the exception of maybe two of them, including Rincewind, I think all the wizards are Tories, really. I'm trying to find. I've got the have a scan of the graphic novel open on my other monitor here, and I'm just looking at the wizards, and they're presented relatively stereotypically in the graphic novel, which is obviously how I picture them because that's how I first experienced them. So yeah, so I think I was maybe guided very much towards a traditional mind view of the wizards, but I much prefer your interpretation actually. You know, and as you say, it's interesting how they decided to do that in the movie later on. So is this something? I know that they spent way too much time setting up the city and having Rincewind and Two Flower meet and everything that happens. That took a long time to get going in the Color of Magic. But do you feel then that all this introduction to the politics of the Unseed University that was kind of easier to read for you? That was a bit more exciting, or
Yeah, because
because
uh,
people are getting murdered?
Tryman and Galder are there from the start. And actually, it's kind of interesting the way that Galder flits in and out of the story. Um, he's the first sort of half of it has a lot of Galder in it, and then he disappears for half the book and
Mm.
lets the narrative of the star and the spell take over. So when he returns for the climax, somehow Sir Terry manages to just pull that off like it's not a thing. Most storytellers would have a character like Galder all the way through.
Yeah,
But
I can see
there's
that.
enough setup there that you know exactly who Galder is. There's that strength of character.
Yeah, and I think because we know we're in this kind of fantasy world where like the wizards are an institution that like it's not it's about Rincewind and he's a wizard and he went to this university. So we know the next time we pick up a Discworld book, there's a pretty good chance we're going to come back to the Unseen University. So these characters aren't just being set up for this story, or this precinct isn't just being set up for this story. So I think he has that freedom where he can just dip in and out of it almost at his own discretion. Um, and I think my recollection the first time round, certainly, of the wizard stuff was that Tryman was quite a compelling antagonist. I think that's something that the Color of Magic had lacked slightly, was like an overarching antagonist, I guess, and that's a role that Tryman fills to a greater or lesser extent, depending on your opinion, I suppose. So actually, that's kind of what I wanted to gauge, whether you felt the story benefited from that.
Yeah, yeah. It came over as a massive pain in the butt, much like Galder was. I think I kind of felt sorry for him at towards the end, where he is occupied by the major spells of the octavo, and um, I think that's quite an accomplishment to have to be careful not to say feat again.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah.
true.
Uh,
And how it's interesting. It's something we'll discuss as we go on. I'm sure how Tryman is portrayed really differently in the book than how he is portrayed on screen when they did the movie, and it's something that comes up in a few of the Discworld adaptations, and it's been approached similarly. How he writes these villains that, like you say, you find yourself sympathizing with a little bit by the end, and that's a sign of really, really good writing, in my view. But it's something that is difficult to translate to screen. It's something that a really, really good prose writer like Sir Cherry can pull off on the page, but is almost impossible to translate directly to the screen. I mean, if you create something like that from scratch, you've got a chance. If you're trying to adapt it from the page, you're going to get in trouble. And they managed it, I think, to put their own spin on it for the movie. But yeah, I certainly felt, thinking back on this compared to my experience last month of reading The Color of Magic, that just having the wizards, just having their own machinations in the background, having that kind of tangible link the whole way through the story between the Octavo spell in Rincewind's head and the wizards back home trying to figure it all out and trying to figure this star out and all that, just made it feel way more coherent. And I feel like I definitely didn't give this book enough credit at the time. So much of it went over my head at the time, so it was a real pleasure to go back and reread it. And I felt, despite the fact that it's, again, 2 months in a row, slightly breaking our podcast format, rather than going back and rereading the novel, I went back to reread the graphic novel so that I could have that nostalgia hit, that I feel is necessary for me to fulfill my role in this format. And I'm just kicking myself. It's like, it's so many of the gags that I missed back then are so obvious.
oh, I can't wait to see it then. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example because I know you're gonna want to hit me with some quotes, some of your favorite quotes. But I think at age 11, I'd never heard the word dentures before, because like we would have called them false teeth, right?
Right.
So the whole dentures thing, with just like didn't get it. I had no idea what they were talking about, and I had this kind of vague memory that was jogged actually by something that somebody was posting on the Discworld subreddit this last week or two. So guys guys and girls on the subreddit and everybody in between are always posting about jokes that they missed the first time round in Discworld books, and there's very, very few posts about The Color of Magic and The Light Fantastic, because I think people have either read them to death or they're just not their favorites. But somebody did make a post about the Din Tours, and it just, like a light bulb just went off my head. And I was like, yeah, man, I did not get that at all when I first read it. Dentures. I just didn't know what dentures were. And another user posted this kind of theory that din chewers meant dinner chewers, like they're for chewing your dinner. I'm like, I bet you when I was 11 years old, that's the kind of thing explanation I would have come up with. Like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. They're just dinner chewers. Okay, not realizing that it's an actual really clever play on words. So, I mean, Terry was doing his best to throw all this great wordplay in, and so much of it was just going over my head at the time. So it's been a real, real pleasure to revisit that. And I'm sure you've got some favorites that are gonna light up a few light bulbs for me as well.
I'm looking at this pearl of wisdom here. What is it that a man may call the greatest things in life? Hot water, good dentistry, and soft lavatory paper.
Yeah, Cohen's introduction, as you hinted at earlier, is just perfect. And such an obvious Conan the Barbarian reference that you just know where you are in that world straight away. Even if you aren't reading the graphic novel and you don't have the great painting of Cohen and his barbarian finery, you just know exactly where you are at that moment.
I had a lot of fun with
perfect.
Cohen. I've taken to hanging out in the social video chat room lately, and those things eat up a lot of time. So to cope, I started reading long bits of the Light Fantastic aloud.
Oh, cool.
And Cohen was just so much fun to read aloud. Saved the most.
Because that's something, I guess. I mean, I have flicked through the digital copy of the novel as well. That I guess when you first read a graphic novel or read a story like this in graphic novel format, Cohen's speech bubbles are written phonetically, as you would expect, because he's got no teeth. So it's that dentistry, as you just pronounced it. But that's how it's written in the novel too, right?
Yeah.
Like when it comes to characters like that, the Terry's always writing that way. It's the way that the dialogue sounds, and it just brings those characters to life so well.
One of the things I noticed was in amongst all this world building, the city, the university, the edge of the world, Terry is taking all these little like he's telling us about the search for onions and talking trees again. We have more so he's taken the time for this. And then there's the bigger stuff like Herenna, who kind of I feel is another character who kind of dominates the narrative, certainly in the first half.
Yeah, and if I'm being really honest, it was a character that I'd completely forgotten about until I went back to look at this again for the podcast. And that's a bit like Hrun, maybe in The Color of Magic. It's like one of those slightly more straight up characters, straight up fantasy characters, I guess, where like they're well written and they serve the story really well, but they don't leave the same mark on the reader, or they don't have the same kind of longevity as all the big heavy hitting Discworld characters that we know and love do. So I think that's part of how he's still kind of finding his feet, even in this one, even though we're both kind of saying that it's almost night and day between The Color of Magic and The Light Fantastic in terms of that world building and that narrative craft. He's still experimenting a little bit, and I think just the fact that Herenna is a woman isn't enough to kind of give that character the sort of same longevity as like a geriatric version of Conan the Barbarian. For whatever reason, that seems to have more legs in terms of like how Sir Terry and his sense of humor and how he imagines the world.
Yeah,
you know, Cohen's a character that's going to stick around and Herenna isn't, and I think that's quite interesting. But that's not to say that feminist themes and issues aren't going to be addressed in future books. They absolutely are. But
he's quite
Herenna,
explicit about it, isn't he, with his entrance? I've got the
oh,
text in front of me. Actually,
yeah, go for it. Let by all
now,
means.
there is a tendency at a point like this to look over one's shoulder at the cover artist and start going on at length about leather, tight boots, and naked blades. Words like fool, round, and even pert creep into the narrative until the writer has to go and have a cold shower and lie down. And then he goes on about pick of the leather racks in Wu Hong Ling's Oriental Exotica and
Yeah,
martial aids.
I think that's actually one of the
She was
few.
sensually dressed.
Yeah, one of the few jokes that's actually better in the graphic novel, because obviously there's a panel of Herenna. So the artist, he's is having to draw what he's saying. and he's making fun of him for drawing it, you know. So yeah, I mean, you're right, that introduction is still great, but like beyond this story, you know, I don't think we ever meet, sorry, very, very mild spoiler, but I don't think we ever
Oh,
come back to Herenna. But we come back to different feminist issues
yeah.
and themes. Because there is another one that just reminded me. You might have it as one of your sticky notes, but I believe there's a quote about women not being allowed at the Unseen University.
Uh, Unseen University had never admitted women, muttering something about problems with the plumbing, but the real reason was an unspoken dread that if women were allowed to mess around with magic, they would probably be embarrassingly good at it.
So, as we have the rule of not spoiling anything beyond what we're reading currently, except for the titles. We know that the next book in the series is called Equal Rights, Rites, like magical rights. So, you know, we sort of get a sense that maybe this is an issue that we're going to return to sooner rather than later, perhaps.
You've just set off a half dozen questions in my head.
Yeah, well, that's
My
one for
toes are
next month,
tickled.
perhaps. Yeah, but I think you know, once obviously we're laying a lot more groundwork for the Unseen University as a precinct in this novel than we did in the previous one. And in retrospect, I didn't pick up on this at the time because I don't know if that particular code appears in the graphic novel. But yeah, definitely some groundwork being laid for future stories there. So it is. I find it really interesting as an old reader going back, and especially with these early books, just like seeing the stuff that he's throwing at the wall and knowing what sticks and what doesn't is really, really interesting. So yeah, even though like I totally enjoy all the stuff with Herenna, and there was some in the graphic novel and in the movie, uh, but I sort of know that, you know, when we look at kind of more female focused stories later in the series, I can kind of see why he maybe chose to go different ways with it, because I think if more Herenna focused stuff, that would be his third bite probably at the barbarian story in as many books, you know. So it's kind of good, I think, that he kind of moves away from it after this. But that's not to say that, you know, she's not an entertaining element in this particular story.
Around we get another really interesting female character about that point is Isabel,
Oh, of course.
Death's daughter, and
Yeah,
she creeped the hell out of me.
way harder to avoid spoilers at this point.
Oh, okay. The whole the whole metaphysical narrative that the Terry's building of Death's house and the four horsemen playing poker and um yeah,
That got you thinking about Good Omens, right?
um no, not quite because of
Okay.
the earth-based good omens thing, but this image that he paints of the thin blue line between the earth where Twoflower and Rincewind are passed out and into this nether sphere. Really like spiritual world building going
Mm.
on. And it struck me as an odd turn to take, but you know, I'm in for the ride. It was she left a Isabel left an impression. There's some really great writing in that point about of the clock with the long pendulum and the slow tick tock that set teeth on edge.
Mm.
Um,
He loves that world for sure, and you can tell. And I always kind of wonder again, hopefully without giving too much away, but since our rule is, you know, if you look at the titles, the books that are coming up, you've got Mort and you've got Reaper Man, so you know that there's going to be books about death. So you know there's going to be stuff that's set in this world. And I always kind of, I didn't always. I mean, now looking back at it on this second reading, 2.5 decades later, seeing those scenes and knowing a little bit about what's to come, wondering was he getting a little bit impatient that had he had this idea about death's world and he was just impatient to write it? Because like you say, I mean, I agree that those scenes do kind of stand out a little bit in a good way because like the writing is so good and it's really well realized, and like Isabel's a really creepy character. But if it feels like the most obvious foreshadowing for something else in this book, would you agree?
Hmm. Yes.
Because it's a
Yeah.
whole different world. I mean, literally, like we're already in this
Yeah.
crazy world of Discworld, and then all of a sudden we're in this like metaphysical world where Death has a house and a daughter, and it's like it's related, but like there's definitely more going on there than it applies to this story, right?
Hmm. Well, this book one in this story had some um a lot more subtle clues to how this ends. So um yeah, I guess that's not the answer you were looking for.
I
Um
well, I feel I'm jumping the gun again. I know it's so hard not to just like totally unload all the opinions that I have about
no,
how
no,
this
no,
like
I can't hear you.
yeah, how it fits into the work as a whole. But it's kind of fun to dance around it too, you know. And as I love that, like I know that you've looked at the titles, and I love that I can always just come back to a book title that I know you've seen and just draw some dotted lines, if not some full lines between things for you, things to look out for as you go. So it's cool if you've, I mean, if you responded well to that stuff, you're definitely in for a treat in a couple of books. So
We were chatting before we come on about some really good netherworld puns. Um, one that had me in stitches was grinning like a necrophiliac in a morgue and neck romance.
this is stuff that went way over my head when I was 11 years old. You'll be glad to know. But yeah, you cannot beat. We talked about it last month. We're gonna bang on about it a lot. You can't beat that wordplay, and it only gets better. And I love actually how kind of naughty it is at times, like the necrophilia gag. Because I think that's something I don't always associate with Terry Pratchett's writing that much, is that it can be quite risque at times. And this book with like the Herenna stuff we discussed already, and these gags, like he's not banging you over the head with it, but like you know it's there, and it just gives it that kind of special little flavor, doesn't it?
Yeah. So
So
what was your I'm in charge now. I'm interviewing you as the
oh shit,
leader.
okay.
Back to what age were you again when you were
I
11?
was 11 years old.
Well, what did you make of old granddad and the rocks and um
Yeah, like all that kind of creature stuff. So I mean, I was familiar with like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and like I was versed in fantasy to a degree. So that stuff was actually all the stuff that I responded really well to at the time, and it looks great in the graphic novel as well. So yeah, anytime where they were like mixing it up with yeah, with old granddad, with and that reveal, it's a classic fantasy reveal where like, oh, we're in the troll's mouth, and it's like they
yeah.
think they're in a cave. I mean, it's Empire Strikes Back, right? you know, it's yeah. So I loved all that stuff. That actual that whole sequence actually is probably a highlight for me, as I mentioned kind of before. All the kind of the stuff with the wizards and whatever probably didn't grab me quite as much as that adventure back from wherever they land back on the disc, back to Ankmore Park, where they meet Cohen. They end up in the mouth of the troll, the gingerbread house.
Gingerbread
Uh,
houses. Yeah, it's the only one I skipped over. And my word, wow.
there's there's so much going on, and obviously, like when you're a kid, that those fairy tales are quite fresh in your head, and that was kind of mind blowing for me because that's kind of it's really early on. It's like it's pretty much the opening, isn't it? It's like the first place they go once they get back
Yeah.
together. Yeah. So I would say that scene probably more than anything else is probably what hooked me in, and like just the idea that yeah, that like a fairy tale is being treated in this kind of like adult way. Like, how would this actually work in real life? That was pretty mind blowing, and that's like calling card of Terry Pratchett, I guess, isn't it? Is like taking fantasy tropes to their logical extreme and playing that for humor. So that was like you
Just such
just
beautiful fun
the
subversion.
coincidence that that was a fairy tale and I read it when I was young, that just grabbed me hook, line, and sinker. And some of the rest of the stuff was hit and miss, but I was sold at that point. So yeah, so that worked out.
I think so. Um, the trolls turn into rocks when they're old. And I have a theory. We also skipped over the journey on flying rocks, which are also computers.
Oh yeah, the
I
whole druids. Yeah.
now I thought I was being clever coming up with a Pratchett academic theory. So you have flying computer rocks and rocks transforming into trolls and back again. Did Terry Pratchett secretly inspire the GoBots rock lords of the 1980s? Robots in disguise, but not so expensive. They changed into rocks. It's the ultimate subterfuge. But no, I looked at the timeline and the Rock
Doesn't
Lords
line up.
were released the same year that The Light Fantastic was released.
Wow. So that was the zeitgeist at the time was
Was
rock robots,
we were
rock
all about
computers.
the rock robotry.
Interesting. Who knew? Who knew? There's some great stuff. Again, that'll come up later in the series. You know, we meet a lot more trolls, obviously, as we go forward, and that connection between silicon-based life and computers and how we understand computers and how computers function is something that he gets into. And he's his own. You know, he was quite an early adopter of technology and stuff. So the way he's writing about it in the 80s and 90s feels incredibly fresh. But I'll say no more. But yeah, that whole business with the druids and the flying rocks and the fantasy computer at the time was too much for me, for sure. to go from the like super relatable gingerbread fairy tale to like, yeah, this like almost metaphysical idea of a computer. At the time I was like, you know, playing Quake 1 on my dad's work laptop. Like it didn't compute for me. So
Well, I was thinking by the time this came out, you would have had the Commodore 64 and the Sinclair Spectrum on the market, which were the machines that I was growing up with, and they were you know, the stuff was the graphics and the games were coming on a bit. The Spectrum keyboard was still like a giant eraser, but it had lots of different colors, so that was okay. And somehow the games tended to be better. The Commodore had this big keypad, but it was only a few years after the ZX81, which I grew up with, which was um, essentially like a large ashtray with the memory plugged into the back of it. And if you the keyboard was just flat, the keys were like built into the plastic. And if you tapped the keys too much on the 1K computer, the 16K RAM pack extra memory would sort of just go off and on again. So it was really like it was rocks. It
yeah, so
was
it felt like literally like you're stacking rocks. Okay. I get how it's
brilliant.
relatable now. I get it. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so there's so much more to come with that. And trolls, the way that he deals with just trolls as a rock-based life form is really cool and it's really clever. So, and you can see those in the Light Fantastic, those ideas are kind of separate. But when he eventually something clicks and he puts them together, and that's where the magic happens for me. Um, we haven't really talked about how this story ends, and I think we have the freedom to do that now that we've warned people that we're kind of in for a penny / in for a pound in
So one
terms
of
of
the great
spoilers.
things about the rocks and the rock transformation is that you have this red star going on in the background, and that enhances, amplifies it. Um, and as we're going through, you get this star reflected all over the city. It as it gets closer, it colors the streets and the buildings. Um,
So it's building towards this apocalypse or this apocalyptic event. People assume it's an apocalyptic event and they act accordingly as as a mob, essentially, I guess. And and this is again something I jumped the gun with a little bit last month about getting a little bit impatient, I guess, about how you responded to Ankh-Morpork as a setting, because I think how how he writes crowds of people, how he writes the mob, as it were, is really intuitive, and it's really unique. And this is, I actually had sort of forgotten that this is kind of the first real go at that, which is this kind of doomsday cult. This red star is coming, and yeah, the people act accordingly, essentially. And I know there was a particular quote that you liked about the mob or the looting. Oh, give it away. Cut that.
Um,
There's a
I
particular
was,
a
yeah, I was
particular quote
just
that you liked about the mob violence.
just saw that on the screen. I was just thinking there's a line I don't have here that um Terry talks about Ankh-Morpork having a particular smell, um, and that being one of its sort of key characteristics.
Yeah, the river is just based on the Thames, obviously. It's like it's its own character in the series almost. And I think that's meant to be the source of the pong. All the shops have been smashed open. Well,
Well,
I haven't done a quote yet. I'm gonna do it
if you've
actually.
got it handy, go for it.
Yeah.
I think I
So
just pulled it
this
out of my document. So,
the favorite of
oh,
mine, and it really encompasses how Terry writes the kind of nameless, faceless citizens of Ankh-Morpork from here until the end of the series. And it's all the shops have been smashed open. There was a whole bunch of people across the street helping themselves to musical instruments. Can you believe that? Yeah, Sid Rincewind. Looters, I expect. Loot, as in LUT. Yeah. So there you go. I mean, and that is like that's as dad joke pun as you can get, but like it comes out of absolutely nowhere.
yeah.
And that's what makes it so funny. Um, but yeah, his there's a lot going on about how he sees human nature, especially how human nature differs when you're dealing with one human than in comparison to a crowd of humans or a mob. And I'd forgotten how central that was actually to the plot of this book, this really early book. And it's something we'll come back to again and again, and something that really, really drew me into the franchise for sure.
I mean, he's quite capable of hitting people over the head with statements on humanity and stuff, and he's incredibly entertaining when he's doing it. But he's also very good at this nuance, this sort of drip drip approach, and the sort of subtlety and throwaway, well, not throwaway lines, but like sort of one line puns
Yeah, absolutely. I mean
that
that's just
serve
a
that.
like that's a good example. I think like that's just a dad joke, like loot as in looters versus loot the guitar, but it is saying, you know, it's saying something about how crowds of humans react when they're afraid, which is they smash things and steal loots, I guess. So yeah, so that's the perfect illustration of your point there, I think. So before we move on to other mediums, do we want to talk about how the story wraps up a little bit, just to bring it to its natural conclusion, or have we
Yeah.
haven't skipped too much, have we?
Uh, we've got the rioters, the Star Cult, Two Floor, Bethan, and Rincewind take refuge in a magic shop, which I really enjoyed, because then you
Oh
get
yes,
the
of course.
origin of, or the related potential origin of the luggage, who is very dominant in this book as well. Um,
Of course, yeah, and then obviously that's where we meet Lockjaw as well. So that we have to make reference to that now that you set it up. What I felt actually on the rereading of it, because at the time it was all a little bit high fantasy, a little bit bobbins to me, but going back and reading it again, having immersed myself in Discworld for the last 20 plus years, was like that whole business with the baby world turtles being born and creatures from the dungeon dimensions bursting through and there being a proper kind of magical battle. It's like, holy, I mean, this is like big, high stakes stuff for
yeah.
Discworld, you know? And not to temper your expectations or whatever, but not every single book is going to be dealing with this kind of, world ending or world birthing stuff. So going back to it and seeing like what big swings were being taken, especially compared to how things were handled in The Color of Magic, where it was like episode here, we're gonna do a Lovecraft episode, we're gonna do a barbarian episode, and then we're gonna have a cliffhanger. To go from that to having like two competing apocalyptic storylines that crashed together in the finale was like pretty
Yeah.
big, a pretty big step up narratively, I thought. And revisiting it, just there now, the last few weeks, really impressed with how they're kind of woven together and how he doesn't forget that the real story, like the real ending of the story, is when Rincewind and Tuflar part, because it's really all been about them, about their interweaving character journeys. So it's masterful actually, considering how early he is in the series. And I actually don't think, and maybe people listening to this might disagree, I can think of one or two possible competitors, but like in terms of high stakes in terms of the story for the world and the story for these characters, I think it'd be hard to, it's kind of hard to beat this even as the series goes on,
I mean, I suppose there's an element of it in hindsight looks quite uh, odd to accelerate this world, because you have, we mentioned the rock lords earlier, the rock trolls, sorry, um, the magical battle, the star, and to sort of bring it so close. And of course, you've got the wonderful twist, which is the birthing.
Mm.
But to really, this is, I guess Pratchett's a young novelist. He doesn't know if there's going to be any more Discworld. He's throwing it all out there. He's accelerating for the sake of telling a great story.
That's a good point. That's a great point, actually. Yeah, because I think that's kind of if anybody sets out to tell a story in this medium, in this way, these days, whether it's in prose or television, comics, whatever, like they're gonna try and write a trilogy, right? But you're right. He throws everything at this second book, and it's way better for it because he's not throwing it all at the first book. The first book ends on a cliffhanger. He's throwing it all at the second book, and it's a significant step up in terms of characterization, in terms of narrative structure, in terms of everything, even in terms of humor, I would argue.
Can I do another quote? I just ran across this thing. We were talking about the social element of it,
Yeah.
and people's beliefs. And there's this line about quite a long line. The most senior gods, of course, had large and splendid temples, but the trouble was that later gods demanded equality, and soon the holy areas were sprawling with lean-tos, annexes, loft conversions, sub-basements, bijou flatlets, ecclesiastical infilling, and trans-temporal time-sharing, since no god would dream of living outside the holy quarter, or as it had become, 3/8. So he's got all these like little 2-3 word puns mixing religion with housing, and that's just magical.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. I mean, you can't beat. I don't think anybody can beat that. And that's a passage that like you've picked out as a memorable quote that has almost nothing to do with the main story at all. He's just addressing the fact that the gods played an active role in the first book and then don't really in this book. Like that's what's being addressed there, isn't it? Like the idea of that the chess game isn't really happening anymore.
It's got nothing to do with Great Atuan, and
Yeah. So, and even at that, even when he's kind of like making excuses, he's doing it beautifully. you know, it's fantastic. I wonder, is that a good time to move on to
I just
our?
want to talk about some of the puns as well.
Oh, we would be
And
remiss
some
not
of
to. Yeah.
the sort of like the little drops that lead to Great Atuan's birthing.
Yeah.
I mean, the most obvious one is as somebody is talking about an agenda, I think, at the Unseen, and it's what's a gender. They're talking about Great Atu, and Death is saying that he can't be involved with what's coming because it's actually about life. But this is right at the start of the book. We don't know this yet.
Tremendous foreshadowing. Yeah, isn't there a scene where Tryman calls the wizards back, and the agenda only has one item on it, so it's an agendum. And I remember, like, I just started secondary school, so I just started learning Latin because that's what we do here for whatever reason. So I was like, it's a Latin joke, and I got it, and I couldn't believe that I got it. So that always stuck with me. And the not liberal, but there's sprinklings of like that kind of classical, using the classics as a basis for humor throughout the series. But I couldn't believe it when I got a joke in Latin. I felt so cool. No, that's not right. Cool is definitely not the right word. It was an achievement of some description, for sure. Yeah, I just remembered that one. Any other highlights on the pun parade then?
Probably a bunch. Oh, Shoop.
Oh yeah, of course.
I've just got a note that says Shoop on it. Oh, say the wizards, if we're going to be like that, then what about all those studded collars and oiled muscles down at the Young Men's Pagan Association?
Oh yeah.
YMPA. Yeah, loads. I think we might go over the quotes in a while. So we can pick a favorite quote each.
Yeah, well, we're gonna, as the series progresses, we're gonna have to get a bit more judicious with this. Otherwise, we could just spend an hour picking puns back and forth with each other. But we definitely have to make sure we make time to do our favorites, maybe even our top three or something like that for each book.
Cohen versus the Luggage was something I enjoyed. They both have incredibly forceful characters.
Yeah,
just seeing them sort of try to one up one another.
And if you pitch that out of context to somebody who doesn't know anything about Discworld, like, it's an old man fighting a suitcase. Yeah, that sounds, what are you even talking about? How's that even possible? But that's a box office fight on the Discworld. You know? Yeah, like there's something completely unique about that.
Bethan really impressed me from the start. She has her opener about having saved herself, having not gone out on Saturday nights for her entire life, and I think there's something, despite the fact there's like 70 years between them, there's something quite sweet about their coupling and her sort of adoration of her kind of. I mean, she's a total fangirl, but she's quite sensible. She's not a nutter, which helps.
Yeah, and I think the fact that he's doing something a little bit different with Bethan, who's like the virgin who's being rescued by Cohen, still falls in love with him and everything, but it's not this like the stereotypical damsel in distress. Like, he's playing with that trope. And again, I think that's another thing that gets in the way of Herenna a little bit, maybe. You know, like he's trying to do a little bit too much with. I don't think he's really like self-assured enough yet at this stage in terms of writing those female characters and subverting those tropes. So he's maybe tried to do one too many in this storyline, and I think Bethan works better, and is arguably underserved slightly in the adaptations as a result, because it's kind of hard to pull off that transition again, which is a shame.
At this point in the conversation, PJ and I decided to tangent into an overly long consideration of the graphic novels and Sky TV adaptation. So long, in fact, that we're going to put it out as a bonus episode. So let's fast forward for a shorter, smoother podcast.
Again, the Light Fantastic's not one that I have as big opinions on when we get to later books, especially the City Watch books. Then we'll be having a different conversation.
It's quite a ride. I really enjoyed it. I'm obviously, what I'm anticipating is Rincewind at the Unseen University. Is he going to stick the course? Is he going to be in a position of power where he changes the university itself? Those are the sort of the obvious questions. I feel that Two Flower has enough of a not an ending, but certainly a very good rest point for us to leave him there for a while. And I know we are going to be seeing a bit more of Rincewind over
For
the
sure.
course of the books.
I was touched by that ending in a way that I wasn't the first time around, once you're a bit older and you've had, relationships and friendships that have ended, whether on good terms or on bad terms, you've met people who've left a mark on your life that you know that you're never going to see again. Like that's not something that's happened to you when you're 11 years old, but it's certainly happened to me many times now that I'm 36 years old. So yeah, I find their ending in this book a lot more touching and a lot more poignant this time around. And on that note, we should perhaps move towards our own parting. But first,
some mail.
Our, yes.
Letters to I've never read Discworld. Or if you can suggest a better title for this part of the show. We've had a really good response that I've just been sort of all giggly and warm about how open and welcoming the Discworld community of fan readers are. They've just been really so lovely to me and to you, PJ.
Yeah, and how are we doing? How are we doing numbers wise? Are they listening to us?
Numbers wise, we are doing very well.
Awesome.
I think we're over 100. I'm pretty sure we're over 120, 130.
Oh wow, that's great.
We had on our slow first day 2, we had 75 listens.
Oh wow, that's great, guys. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for joining us.
A few people have been really going and spreading the word. Elizabeth and Ben at the Pratchett podcast, who have also made us members of the Guild of Podcasters and Recappers.
It's quite an honor. Thank you.
We have our own wiki page. Thank you. Thank you. I love the attention. We've had some very nice things said about us from Joanna and Francie at their podcast, The Truth Shall Make You Fret.
Love that. That's a great title. Thanks, guys.
We've had some nice mail from Steve Jeffrey, who got put in touch with us through The Truth Shall Make You Fret. Fun first episode. I go way back with Pratchett. Picked up the first 3 in paperback around about when they came out. Then had a standing order with my parents for the latest hardback for my birthday and or Christmas. I do like that you're starting from the beginning, despite all the reading list recommendations, to start with one of his more accomplished works, as chronological order is the way most of us got into him in the first place.
That's a really good point, unless you're me and you just skipped the first one by accident.
But yes, I like that idea of somebody having a Christmas subscription and just every year getting a Discworld book or 2.
Yeah, that is great, because I mean that's like your whole adult life potentially, depending on what age you are, where you're just gonna have a nailed on great book to read twice a year. Perfect. Bizarrely, well, not bizarrely, but I had one question come in to my personal Twitter, but for some reason it's a question for you, Andy. And it comes from Roasty at Roasty Buns on Twitter, and he wants to know whether you have a preacher poster behind you in the video podcast.
I do. I don't know if I should delve into bollocks. So this is a Glenn Fabry piece that he created for the TV show. And so there's the image of I forget the actor's name.
Dominic something.
Dominic, it is Dominic.
We're on first name terms. It's Dominic.
So, which of course, as you can recognize, is a recreation of the cover of Preacher 1. Now, we have a chain of B&M, like a reduced store. And I found some soap in it. And the soap on one side said arse, and on the other side said face. So I picked up a few of these. Glenn was living in Belfast at the time. And I presented Glenn with some arse face soap. And he signed the bottom of the Preacher poster, which he had with him in the pub that night. Thanks for the soap, Andy. Glenn.
Perfect. That's a great Glenn Fabry story. Yeah, I sold him a packet of cigarettes once. That's my Glenn Fabry story. It's not quite as good. So that wraps up.
Few other.
Oh, is there? Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yes. my friend Julia, Annika, and Jessica have been pushing us over video cam chats.
Awesome.
That's great. We have a friend of mine on Facebook, Susanna Hooker, who is going to be joining us on our book read.
Oh, great.
So hi, Susanna. Suzanne, sorry. Hi, Suzanne.
Oops.
Welcome to the journey. And if please write in if you're doing this with us. I think I'd heard other people are.
Yeah, we had a couple of people on the Discworld subreddit who asked for us to post when we put up our first episode. We did, and we got some nice comments there. We have a couple of people joining us on our reading, and we had some nice feedback too. User Glitz-1958 says, "Hi guys, just had a listen. Good start. Not easy to launch something like this. You'll get more relaxed and less hesitant this time." Well, hopefully we were yeah, thanks for that. Hopefully you find us more relaxed and less hesitant this time around. I drank a couple of whiskeys first. That certainly helped me. But actually, as we get into this portion of the series, where like I actually do have genuine memories and fondness and nostalgia for these books, unlike The Color of Magic, which I read for the first time last year, you're not going to be able to shut me up, unfortunately. So strap in. And we'll certainly be consulting you guys more as the series goes for any kind of feedbacks, questions, stuff you want us to address. So thanks for joining us.
We should probably I want to throw a big thank you to Tahir Masood, who edited together our cover art. So he sent us 2 pieces. And they've been up on our social media accounts. And I don't actually have a list of our social media accounts. We're up on Facebook, Twitter. Maybe that's it.
Yeah, we're definitely on those. I think I definitely am handling the Reddit side of things for now. I'm PJ Hard 86 on Reddit. You can find me lurking in our Discworlds, usually flogging this or just spouting off mostly about City Watch stuff, which I have to keep Andy away from for at least another few months. So absolutely find me there. Hit me up if you want to chat about the podcast or about Discworld in general. And I think this is going to be a tricky edit for Andy. This one, we're approaching 2 hour mark for us on the record. So I think we should leave it there. I'm PJ Hart. I've obviously read Discworld, but I want to give Andy the last word.
I'm Andy Luke at Andrew Luke, and today I have read some Discworld.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.